Hello, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for our webinar today. I am Rebecca Vicente Sanchez, Director of Strategic Initiatives of Filantropía Puerto Rico, a nonprofit that seeks to amplify the voice and impact of philanthropy in areas of equity, transparency, and social justice. The series of webinars that we continue today is aimed at informing an audience, in particular our members and donors, about the impact of grants we have awarded through Fondo Adelante or the Forward Fund. This is a collaborative fund we launched after Hurricane Maria to support recovery efforts. Today's webinar is being offered live in Spanish to our members. To give you the premiere on the study that the Centro de Periodismo Investigativo, Center of Investigative Journalism, or CPI for its acronym in Spanish, will present to us. We'll share the recording with our wider audience at a later date, once CPI formally launches the study in mid-April. Cooperativa Brújulas, language and healing justice workers will interpret the webinar recording into English, so it will be available in both languages on our website once CPI again launches the study in April. For more information about our excellent interpreters, please write to them at info@coopbrujulas.com or their Instagram page, Coop Brújulas. In today's session, we are joined by Carla Minet, Executive Director of CPI, Annette Martínez Orabon, Director of the Caribbean Institute for Human Rights, and Luis Avilés, Director of Research at Kilómetro, to present the findings of a study on the relationship between access to information and loss of life before and after a hurricane or a catastrophic natural event like Hurricane Maria. Carla Minet has been a freelance independent journalist, researcher, and producer of multiple publications. She was executive director of the organization Prensa Comunitaria. She received her bachelor's degree from the School of Communication at the University of Puerto Rico and her master's degree in journalism from the University of Barcelona and Columbia University. Annette Martínez Orabona is a lawyer with expertise in international human rights law. She directs the Caribbean Institute for Human Rights and is a clinical professor at the Inter-American University of Puerto Rico School of Law. Luis Avilés is a columnist for 80 Grados magazine and author of Contra la Tortura de los Números, book that examines the misuse of statistics in the press and in public policy debates. He is Director of Research for Kilómetro and hopes to celebrate the establishment of universal health care system in Puerto Rico. Luis, me too. I hope to be able to see that. Well, before we begin, I invite our members who are not yet subscribed to our mailing list to do so with the link we're sharing in the chat at this moment so that you can keep up to date with our events. So now, let's start with the webinar. The webinar will last 30 minutes for the presentation, and at the end, we'll have a 15-minute question and answer session. And since we're working this webinar today in a meeting format, you can ask questions directly to our speakers. So with that being made clear, let's go on to the presentation. Go ahead, Carla, Annette, and Luis. Hi, hello, good afternoon to all of you. Thanks to Filantropía Puerto Rico for inviting us to this webinar. It's been about 2 years and a little more since the Center for Investigative Journalism considered the possibility of doing a comprehensive investigative project that on the one hand would have a journalistic dimension, which is the page that is known as loschavosdemaria.com. But we also identified the need for a more in-depth and far-reaching investigation, looking at the major gaps in terms of information that existed during the emergency process, the response, and eventually the beginning of the recovery that has not yet arrived. And for this project, we identified a series of people, collaborators, who had been looking at public health issues, security issues, housing issues, and Annette Martínez was the person to whom we entrusted the challenge of putting together a research process that has been going on for the past year and a little bit more, and that it already has some findings. It is an investigation that we have called Sin información ante el desastre, gestión de la información para el manejo de riesgos socioambientales en Puerto Rico, which roughly translates to without information in the face of disaster, management of information for the socio-environmental risk management in Puerto Rico. The researchers, in addition to Annette and Luis, are Marinilda Rivera Díaz and Luis José Torres Asensio, two collaborators of Annette and the Institute, as well as the Centro de Periodismo Investigativo, the CPI. They did an exhaustive job, and it generated the report that we'll publish virtually in a couple of weeks from now. Annette and Luis are with us today to present a summary of some key points of the report that was, of course, supported by Filantropía PR. The findings of this report indicate, in summary, that the absence of organized and available information allowed that after Hurricane Maria, we lived situations, some of them involving the risk of life and health, that could have been avoided if there had been a plan that was coherent, clear, transparent, and above all, available. When we commissioned this project, we had already had the experience of investigating the deaths from Hurricane Maria and had seen the implications of the lack of information on people's lives. So the initial question that triggered, let's say, this research process is, if this happened in the context of health and in the context of risk management in people's lives, this must have happened in other areas, and we know that it happened. The foundations themselves continually had difficulties to deliver aid, food, water, and to identify where were the areas of need. And that was an information flight that cost lives and had many consequences for many people. So looking at that reality, they focused on some areas that Annette will explain now. Annette is going to do the presentation, and Luis Avilés is going to join the conversation later to comment on what Annette presents, and also to answer any questions that you may have. So without further ado, Annette, go ahead. Thank you. Hello, good afternoon to all of you. I'm going to share with you what the presentation will be here with my screen. Once again, I would like to thank the CPI and Filantropía PR for the opportunity to present the findings, conclusions, and recommendations of our report. Without information in the face of disaster, management of information for the socio-environmental risk management in Puerto Rico. The question of this report that led us as a general conclusion, once we read all the findings and recommendations, the general conclusion that leads us to is that unfortunately in Puerto Rico, there is a serious governmental inability to conceive of information as a key element of planning. Unfortunately, we understand that for our government, information does not deserve to be thought, imagined, foreseen, or designed. That's why we coined the phrase that information in Puerto Rico seems to be unthinkable. The question we asked ourselves as the main interest or objective of this research is aimed at identifying the information needed to both prevent and manage a social environmental disaster. Surprisingly, we found that this is a question that is little studied in Puerto Rico, And we are surprised because it is not for lack of good research, and especially after Hurricane Maria we have, say, various investigations, publications that have addressed the issue of the disaster. Here's a photograph of aftershocks of disaster, a book with a highly valuable content for this topic. However, we note that the specific issue of information management as a research focus is not really present as such. The subject of information is present, but not as an object of study. So this investigation comes to provide that very, very crucial aspect that we ask ourselves. We ask ourselves, what information is necessary for an emergency response to be effective, to be equitable, and to be transparent? And here we emphasize equitable and transparent because it is usual to speak of an effective response to an emergency. But in our case, we also wanted to focus on the issues of equity and transparency because they are cross-cutting. If there's no equity and transparency in the management of the emergency, it will not be effective either. This research used, and here I'm going to pause somewhat. I'm not going to go into much detail, although our research in this report, it is explained in more detail the methodological details that we use, but we use both a public policy analysis as well as a qualitative analysis to do this study. And we start from a theoretical principle, which is that of the sociology of risk, which states that the risks are not the same for all communities or populations. On the one hand, it raises the social inequality of risk, which is that there is an unequal distribution of risk in society. On the other hand, risks are not an exogenous factor alien to human actions, but on the contrary, the risks are manufactured. That is, they are collateral effect of actions that are taken, decisions that are made. And last but not least, we are well aware that risks as such do not have a single definition, although this issue has been addressed in this way. The reality is that depending on who you ask, different populations may have different definitions of risk. So that's what we refer to as the struggles that exist by the definition of risk. Although there are many different areas where information is necessary for the proper management of an emergency, we could not cover all areas. So as a research team, we decided to focus on 4 specific areas that are crucial to emergency management. These are health, electric power, public safety, and housing. We started with the health sector, and on this issue, we identified different areas where information was really either an obstacle or there was a serious lack of information. Starting with the operational plan. The operational plan that we have at hand now, the Joint Operational Plan for Catastrophic Incidents in its section on health, recognizes 2 important things. One, that it is important to know the population with special needs, specifically those who depend on electrical power or other specific services for their health. And number 2, it identifies how it is necessary to ensure the functioning of dialysis units. These 2 aspects that are in the plan now from 2019 to the present proved to be very important in the health issue. In fact, in our study, we focused on the specific group of renal patients in need of dialysis services because they proved to be a population most at risk during the emergency we experienced after Hurricanes Irma and Maria. Within that group, we found various deficiencies in access to the information necessary precisely to receive the health services they needed, and that for that group it is necessary that it be given individually and periodically. We have several quotations from the narratives of these lived experiences, but here we'll include one that we think is important to mention, and that is one of the interviewees who tells us that when he arrived at the clinic, when he finally made made it to the clinic. He made it to health services clinic. Everything was a mess, a chaos. He introduces himself to the clinic and says his name, and one of the coordinators tells him that unfortunately they cannot give him the treatment because his name did not appear. So there was a serious problem in identifying people with specific health needs. Regarding this health issue more broadly, the report identifies a number of specific areas where there are conjunctural problems. One of them is the fragmentation of information that allows access to dialysis services. And we saw that it particularly affects rural populations. We also saw that there is an inability to respond and that there is specific lack of plans for relocation, people who need to be moved or relocated in order to access services. That information was either not existent or, if it existed, poorly managed. Thirdly, the lack of specialized services for pediatric populations. We realize that within that group, the pediatric population is absent. In other words, there's no identification of this very vulnerable population in emergency situations. So we conclude that in the absence of specific changes in the structure, in the organization of the way the health services, the Department of Health currently works, it becomes very difficult to comply with the agreed plans, precisely because it is super fragmented. There are private and public entities that do not communicate with each other as they should. In the case of electrical energy, there are notable absences. They are multiple and at various levels. On the one hand, in terms of emergency plans, for example, we see that there is little real community participation in the development of these plans, that the Electric Power Authority plans are not updated, are not published, and are not communicated. I'll stop here and I'll pause because we find it very serious in the situation that we find by the Electric Power Authority. The plans that were in place for 2017 actually dated back to 2013, of which means that there had been that over a fairly expensive period of time, those plans really hadn't been updated. But that's not all. We find that the existing plans within the Electric Power Authority to deal with the emergency are not discussed with its employees, and there is an absence of regular training on these plans. This is true at the internal level, but there is also a lack of information at the external level. That is, the Electric Power Authority is in relation to other governments, agencies. There is a serious lack of coordination between the Electric Power Authority and Puerto Rico Aqueducts and Sewers Authority, between the Electric Power Authority and the Health Department, between the Electrical Power Authority and Housing. There's no institutionalized communication, not even between the municipalities and the Electric Power Authority. And something that we found really alarming is that the Electric Power Authority doesn't have a mapping, that is to say, a map of the critical health facilities that there is in Puerto Rico. Although its emergency management plan includes hospitals as a priority, there is really no internal mechanism within the Electric Power Authority for it to know in advance the locations and power lines that feed those locations. When we're doing the electric energy study, we realize that what we have in the Electric Power Authority is a historical culture of resistance to access to information. In fact, it's not something that appears from 2017 to now. We have multiple examples in a report of stories from decades ago, of different situations that have occurred in the Electric Power Authority where access to information has been critical and has been non-existent. But for the purpose of this investigation of management after the impact of Hurricanes Irma and Maria, there is a notable deficiency. For example, the Electric Power Authority did not know or did not make public information on the actual condition of the facilities and equipment, nor did it make it public information on the real magnitude of the damage caused by the emergency, nor did it make it public accurate information on the progress made in the recovery process. In fact, the report includes a study that showed that for 5 months after Hurricane Maria, the Electric Power Authority has given incorrect information where it published an an average of at least 17% more electricity reconnection than what was actually happening in the country. In terms of the process after the impact of Hurricane Maria and the emergency as such, all of the electric power authorities' decision-making processes on energy generation also represent a great challenge in terms of knowing the information. And we also specifically found that the population affected by electrical energy installation are some of the populations with the least access or most difficulties in accessing information about the decisions that are made that affect them. In the public security sector, we did a slightly different analysis where we identify the functions that the police were assuming during the emergency. It is very particular here because the plan of the government of Puerto Rico, even the current one, does not really define in a coherent way the functions assumed by the public security agencies. But the analysis of what happened and the functions that the police assumed led us to make these identifications. Functions of road safety, of enforcing curfews, of protecting shelters, and these are functions that do not necessarily fit in what the security needs were in an emergency. For example, in the case of monitoring curfews, we have to say that the literature that we analyzed on the subject of emergencies all points to the fact that it is not really necessary to make or issue curfews. So it is somewhat evident that the function of the police responds more to a restriction, to a limitation, to a more military security perspective than emergency assistance. In the case of road safety, the only thing I would like to comment here is that it seems incredible to us that at this point, with the advances in technology that exist, our public safety agency and those that work directly with the issue of transportation and public roads do not have technology that allows them to have updated information and where even the population can contribute information about what is happening on the roads that could help to have much more accurate information and make it public much more easily and quickly. In the case of shelters, again, we see that police function was much more to protect the place, the space, rather than to protect the people. There is this dichotomy in the vision, and it seems to us that it is very important to look at how to protect even populations that need shelter, and that the same situation, because of who they are and their characteristics, imposes specific situations of risk. As we're going to see now on the issue of people who are at risk of gender-based violence, we understand that this is important for the issue of public security in that sense, to have a vision much more focused on the protection of people at risk. Other functions are to prevent riots, looting, and sabotage. Again, there's no historical experience to conclude that this is a serious problem in emergency situations in Puerto Rico. In the case of the missing persons function, the Puerto Rico police do have a page where they publish a list of missing persons. But that doesn't really differentiate between people who are missing or can be located specifically because of the emergency situation. So that would be an example of how to improve the way information is presented. In the case of gender violence, it's clear that neither the police in Puerto Rico nor the government in general, really until very recently, have taken this on as a priority. But internationally and in Puerto Rico itself, it has been proven that during an emergency, the levels of gender violence increase. So the police should assume a much less militarized look, much less security control, but more protection of such populations at risk. In the housing sector, we see that the absence of information is present from the beginning also in the emergency preparedness plans. We see that the emergency management is very limited to the evacuation of high-risk areas. However, these plans ignore what are, for example, safe housing developments in safe locations, and the risks associated with climate change have also been completely ignored. So we do not see in emergency preparedness plans that these are also necessary aspects to be taken into account. In terms of public housing, which is an aspect within, it's an area within housing that is highly marginalized. We don't really see in the plans an identification of information that affects public housing residents. And in fact, the Department of Public Housing was absent for months after the impact of Hurricane Maria and Irma. There was no response of public housing officials in Puerto Rico. There was no presence of public housing officials in Puerto Rico's public housing projects. And today, the situation of negligence is such that the information needed on the state of the structures of Puerto Rico's public housing projects has yet not to be gathered. So what we see, on the contrary, instead of attending to the gathering of the information that is necessary to prevent further damage, what we see is an attitude that goes in the opposite direction. Displacement, evictions were prompted and promoted just before and after Hurricane Maria. And then we also see that the recovery part, in the response and recovery stage, there are serious problems in the identification of people, for example, who lost their homes. What we have are different agencies, organizations gathering information about those damages, but we don't really have that information verified by a single entity. We also had many problems with duplicate applications for aid and problems where there was no clarity on the appropriate criteria and aid eligibility. An example of this is property titles, which FEMA has been requiring proof of property titles for assistance applications. In the end, it was shown that it was not really necessary to use or prove a title deed for the applications, but the government of Puerto Rico really didn't serve to clarify that information or support the communities that needed the help. We also see that there is a lack of displacement prevention policy. On the contrary, as I said, what we have seen after the emergency has been a sharp increase in evictions and foreclosures. To conclude the conclusions and recommendations of a report, it identifies three needs. The type of information that is collected, how it is managed, and how that information responds to the risks identified. In this tower here that you see, we can identify from its base the starting point, which is the non-existent information. But what we want to go, where we should aspire to go, is to the top, where information is accessible and of high quality. And we find everything in this investigation. Information that exists but it's hidden. Information that exists that is not hidden but is absent. For example, information that exists but is made public late or untimely. That is, if the information is not available in the present time, it makes it very difficult to use. The information that is accessible but is of poor quality, and accessible information of high quality, that is truly the duty that our government must fulfill. For this information management to be adequate, it must be communicated technologically. It is necessary to make use of the technologies that we have available today. This information should be produced collectively. In other words, it is not adequate, it is not useful, and it does not produce information that is equitable and transparent when specific communities are marginalized from their participation in the identification of information, from the identification of risk, and for identification of the ways in which an emergency situation should be dealt with. And finally, the information should be thought of geographically. And by this, we don't just mean knowing, as I mentioned earlier, where certain towns are located or necessary locations such as health clinics are located. Rather, it should be thought of geographically. Taking into account that there is a responsibility at the municipal level as well to produce information that does not have to be dependent from the central government. So there's also something out of place in how that information is managed. Finally, to manage risk, information needs to be available in a form that is easy to understand. We must avoid technocracy in information. We must also recognize what I said at the beginning. The risk is defined differently depending on the people and communities that make up that discussion, and that it is necessary to recognize that there is a very close relationship between risk and social inequality, and that if we do not recognize it, we are going to reproduce more damage in the face of an emergency. In conclusion, we would like to point out that as long as information is not thought out and designed, we will continue to be at risk of similar social environmental disasters happening again. Thank you very much. That is the presentation of our findings and conclusions. Now I invite Luis Alberto to join me to begin a dialogue with you. Thank you. Thank you, Annette. Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you, Annette and Luis. We now open the conversation for anyone who has a question or a comment, feel free to bring them up. The idea is that this is a dialogue, as Annette said, and that we can answer the questions. If there's someone who wants to be the first to say something, go ahead. And if not, then I will start. I will break the ice. Listening to you, it's nothing that we don't already know in essence because we live it, but seeing the data is stronger and more forceful. And the first thing I think, or what comes to mind is, did you find in this study any good example by chance? Is there something in the government? Is there a bright light in the government that, look, something good happened here, or doesn't even exist? Well, I want to comment on one. Can you hear me? Yes. I thought it was fundamental what Annette was telling us, and it seems to me, and we highlight and we point it to the part of the information that it has to be collectively produced. And we were very surprised and very pleased. So I think it's a very good example that it's a high official of the Electric Power Authority. We were very surprised by the possibility of interviewing this high executive of the Electric Power Authority that he said of Electric Power Authority, who told us how important it is that in the brigades that are doing the reconnections at the community level, the people themselves indicate, look, this house is without electricity, and says, look, before these brigades return to the main area, it was very important and fundamental that they were aware of what someone said, because at the central level, there was no idea for several days which sectors had been reconnected or not. And in that sense, he made it very clear that this idea that information has to be produced collectively, it really emphasizes, and it goes along the lines that sometimes the community level has personal or better to say experiential experience and information that it affects them in a particular way that the bureaucratic level that we have doesn't have. He says that people would tell them, we're very grateful when someone told us, look, wait, there is still no electricity at Doña Maria's house, because if they left, that house would be without electricity for several days. So in terms of answering the question, did we see good experiences? Well, the fact that a senior executive of Electric Power Authority acknowledged that at the community level, information was given that helps the effectiveness and equity that you can't pick or you can't find in any other way. I thought it was fantastic. And in fact, and here I add, I think we all lived that experience that every time a truck of Electric Power Authority passed by, they were treated like heroes. So that responsibility that the community has to give that information was very welcome. And I ask myself now, go ahead, Annette. Yes, if I can answer your question too, Rebecca, there are several examples in the report. But I can mention, for example, not necessarily good practices of the government, but good practices of the communities, of the organizations. How do they identify information, important information, and get it to other officials? For example, in the case of dialysis, we saw that organizations dedicated themselves to identify, to create some IDs as dialysis patients so that patients could carry them with them and not be detained in curfew situations because they were not in the exemptions list. But many patients took hours to get from their home to the clinic where they could be treated. So they created these identification cards. So that's a very useful way that the organizations who accompany dialysis patients came up with, and that allow them. We have a documented case of presenting the ID to a police officer, for example, who stops them at a curfew time. And we have a lot of criticism of how the curfew was used, but that's a very creative way in how this was resolved. And that it was taken on by the organizations themselves rather than by the government. But it's something that should be told. That is an example. There are several, but that's one. Thank you, Annette and Luis. I'm sorry. No, go ahead, Monica. I have a question and a comment on that. I live in New York, and I was trying to help, like many in the diaspora, what we could offer after the hurricane. And one group we were able to help a lot because they were super organized was the Pediatric Diabetes Association. They had the names of all the diabetic patients all over the island, and they specifically took care of the insulin they couldn't send to get it delivered directly. I mean, it was an incredible thing in terms of the information and the organization of those parents. In many cases, parents of children with diabetes, that was my comment. But the question I wanted to know, and this doesn't really apply to all the issues, for example, maybe not the electrical energy issue, but I wanted to know, to what extent were you able to analyze the lack of information or some of the problems at the municipal level, or if you focused on the central government? Or I wanted to know if there are good examples of some municipality, or if you got to study that at that level in some example that you can highlight. The study was not focused at the municipal level specifically, but it came up as the information that we collected. We took it into account the direct impact on the victims. That is, a lot of what we collected had to do with what the people who were directly affected told us in their interaction with the different agencies. There are some interviewings who mentioned that their closest level of help with the government was the municipality. That's why we include it as a primary factor. That there is information that a municipality who is closest to the people and should not depend from the central government. So, although it wasn't our focus, it did emerge from the research that the municipalities were, in many cases, the most direct access that the residents had. The other thing I wanted to mention is that there were problems in the coordination, as we mentioned in the coordination of the electric energy service, with the municipalities. The communication, although the mayors continually try to communicate, the coordination was not the best. I see a question. The coordination was not the best because there was no protocol, or because there was no means. Exactly, there wasn't really, as I mentioned, there was an absence of previous work. This, for example, the municipalities are in the best position to say where are the most vulnerable communities. Where are the AGs, the adult care centers? Where are the health clinics that are providing the most urgent services? But that information did not reach the Electric Power Authority. And the Electric Power Authority had its own reconnection protocol. It didn't really do it in coordination with the municipalities. Luis, were you going to mention something? No, well, I see a question if it's time to answer it in the chat. Yes, go ahead. The question says, I imagine the report will come up with some recommendations, any that you would like to share. We basically present an outline on which specific recommendations are mounted. So I want to comment on one because I think it is fundamental. Among the police functions we have seen is road safety. In other words, basically that traffic flows in an adequate manner in a reasonable time and without risk on the roads. Obviously, after a disaster, that's a fundamental thing. Not just to be able to get from point A to point B in a reasonable time, but sometimes in terms of disaster, you have to go to a hospital that's further away, but there is an uninterrupted pathway than a hospital that's closer, but the roads are closed. And in that sense, one of the recommendations in general terms of the areas that we structured, the recommendations is information presented, collectively produced, and technologically communicated. There is a very simple idea that can be made as a concrete recommendation. People in the neighborhoods, in their particular experience, know which roads have some kind of obstruction. We don't have to wait for the police to arrive at a site to see, oh, look, there was a landslide. Please don't go that way. Go on the alternative road. Establishing maps at the cell phone level is so simple. I take out my phone, as you can see, it's CPI on the cell phone. A lot of people already use maps. In other words, the idea of maps is not something alien or different to the reality of Puerto Ricans. Every day, we have a more technological generation. On the same map, we can say, here, there was a slant light. And to the extent that this information is communicated technologically to a wider range of people, it is possibly to fulfill the function of the police, which is road safety. Although it is not necessary to have to highlight a police officer who's going to direct traffic, especially a non-police officer during directing traffic. With this, what I want to point out is that there are certain ways to produce information collectively and technologically, and that are within reach and literally cost nothing to do so. In its consequences, as Carla told us at the beginning, it saves lives. Knowing which roads are blocked saves a life. Thank you, Luis. And along these lines of recommendations, what would be your next steps? You have this study, you already have some data collected and some recommendations. Are there any other steps you are contemplating? Sorry, Annette, continue. I wanted to mention that we're not going to go into detail here about all the recommendations that are in the report. But the report has recommendations that apply to the entire information identification sector of its publication. But there are also specific recommendations by sector. We have recommendations for the health department, specific for the electric power, for the security issue, and for housing. There is a complete table of recommendations attached to the report. So we're not going to go into specific details here, but you should know that once the report is made public, you will be able to find all the recommendations by sector. And to this, I want to add something, if I may, that we also have to be clear about. One of the points that we make in this investigation is that the lack of information has multiple levels, as we present in one of the slides. So to think that trying to fill an information gap solves a problem in the absence of other changes would be delusional. It would even be counterproductive. Take, for example, the case of the police. Public safety is not surveillance, punishment, and a punitive mentality. To the extent that in the recovery plans right now, public safety is basically functions that the police have to do. We would be failing to promote information that advances public safety if we don't change a basic approach that public safety is not punitive surveillance by the police. So one of the steps that we have to do, and that's what we think we're proposing from the beginning, maybe the fundamental step is to think that information has to be planned as part of a recovery process. And that's within a context of other more structural changes that have to be made. If we're able to, or part of our energy, and obviously of the Center for Investigative Journalism, is along the lines of the usefulness of information. How does it have to be planned? How does it have to be communicated? It's a huge step. If we can get that the information be thought out and it be predicted, we could achieve a great deal already. I think a lot of our energies have to go into that line of thinking about information, which the government doesn't currently do. In terms of next steps, once we publish the report in a few weeks from now, in addition to the online publication, we're going to be working on a special supplement that summarizes findings and recommendations that will be, I think, very useful and practical for both the government sector and the nonprofit sector. The support sectors that are activated around an emergency or disaster, including the federal government and so on. As Annette says, there's a sort of a very important annex to a report that structures the specific recommendations, breaking them down into what those are, and what should occur before the disaster, what should occur during the immediate response, and what are some that should occur in the recovery process. And I think that's going to be an important and very useful checklist for officials and for people who deal with emergencies, including municipalities and so on. And another stage of this work that Annette, Luis, Marinilda, and Luis Jose have done also has to do with presenting these findings to key government officials. And I would add to this, a role that I would say that the center assumes in this process is that it seems to me that it is very important that the media and journalists themselves know the findings of the report beyond just reviewing it at the news level, but that they can also understand the role of the press, of the media, in overseeing these things that have to happen so that we do not face a disaster in the same conditions that we faced with Irma and Maria. They can oversee and can ask the right questions beforehand and have the elements to investigate before we reach a point of vulnerability like the one we had after the hurricane. So it seems to me that it can also be very, very useful tool for journalists to look at. With that checklist that's already before the emergency, during and after the recovery process. Thank you very much, Carla. Any other question? Well, that concludes the webinar. Thank you all again. The most I take from here today is what Luis was mentioning, to change in paradigms, that if we don't change the way we see things, obviously that is the key. And that is what we're working towards, I think, all of us from our various platforms. So thank you again. This webinar will be available once you launch your study. We'll make it available on our website in English and Spanish. There you can also find past webinars. We're sharing the link via chat at this moment. If you have some time and have a break, please fill out the feedback form. That always helps us to improve our webinars and other events. And I think we're finishing here. We have other webinars from the Fondo Adelante, the Adelante Fund series in our timeline and our pipeline that we're planning. So we'll be in touch soon. Thank you and good afternoon. Thank you all. Good afternoon. Thank you.